Have you ever been in a coaching conversation where you feel like your client or thinker is just moving from topic to topic to topic super fast and you're furiously taking notes, maybe trying to keep up, trying to understand what's going on, feeling a little like you're playing whack-a-mole as you're trying to go, is this the idea? Is this the topic? Is this what we want to talk about? And it feels like the topic keeps changing through the conversation. The harder you chase it, the more oblique it seems to you, and it feels really overwhelming and chaotic as a coach when you find yourself in that position. But today we're going to talk about what's really going on here. So let's get into it. The first thing I want to point out is it is so easy to get sucked into all the stories. They kind of come down like rain, and we can just be like, ooh, that's really interesting. Ooh, that's really interesting. Ooh, that's really interesting. And so we end up asking questions about the interesting things that are coming up. And there's a distinction that I think is really important, which is there's a difference between interesting and important as a coach. So if my questions are leading the person into more and more of the story, I need to pay attention to that in my own work. In this particular example that I'm going to be using today, I was having a mentor coaching session with a coach, and we were looking at one of the calls that they had brought to the mentor coaching. And in it, their client was all over the place. They had a lot of things going on. There was a graduation weekend. There was a work situation where they had to have a difficult conversation. They had brought up an interesting story about making dinner one night and not being up to Martha Stewart standards. And the coach was just sort of all over the place. The client came in and was saying things like, I'm just spinning. It feels like I'm just all over the place. And then she's telling all of these stories. And pretty soon the coach was pretty much spinning and all over the place also. And one of the things that when we were looking at the conversation that the coach was having, the thinker had said, I really want to be present. I really want to have clarity about how to be present in these different moments for the graduation, for the work situation, for making dinner for my family, for whatever situation I find myself in. I really want to have this sense of presence and really being fully there. There was a soccer game also, I think, that was emerging out of one of the many stories. And because the coach was unintentionally focusing on all these different stories as though they were different topics, what happened was she got really confused. Actually, what she said was, I feel like, I was up in the balcony watching the dancing, and before I knew it, I got sucked onto the dance floor, and I'm just furiously trying to keep up with, whatever the dance moves were we were doing. And it felt really awkward like that. And I think some of that comes in where we are so busy trying to wrap a perfect present and put a pretty bow on it and hand it back to the thinker that we're doing too much work and we're not fully present ourselves, which is sort of the irony, right? The client comes in, they're spinning and they want to have presence, and the coach is finding themselves spinning and they're out of presence also. And as a result of this, they're losing the thread of what the client is actually there for. And so this second piece being, topics may change, but the outcome doesn't often change. The stories, or what seem like topics, the stories that somebody is sharing often are very connected to the outcome that they said they wanted. So for instance, in this conversation, the spinning, which the starting state for the thinker, and the presence and clarity about how to be present and fully engaged with their kids, with their job, with their family, with the situation they find themselves in, was the container of the coaching conversation, spinning to presence. And that overarching goal of the conversation, I didn't see change as we were looking at the transcript. What changed was all the different stories that came up during the conversation. And part of what happens here is, I think, really important, is especially for external processors. So also take this into consideration when you're working with external processors, of which I am one, is that sometimes the way that an external processor is going to connect dots and make meaning is to bring up all these different illustrative stories of the experience that they're having. So, because of the way the coach asked questions of the thinker, that led the thinker to give yet another example of the spinning. Now, they weren't being clear. Well, here's another example of spinning. And the coach wasn't asking an example, like a question that was really obvious, like, tell me more about another situation in which you're spinning. So it was happening sort of as a meta message below the context of the conversation they were having, where the coach says, can you say more about that? And so the client may be thinking, I haven't explained it enough. Let me explain it again. Gives you a different story to explain it yet again. And because it was focused on the spinning, the coach just kept getting more and more stories. Versus if it had been directed towards the outcome, presence, the coach then starts to ask questions that sound more like this. Instead of tell me more about what's going on or tell me more about that experience, they say instead, given what you just shared in that story about the soccer and the job, how does that inform what you need to pay attention to so that you can be fully present? Because I understand where they want to go on this end of the conversation, I can ask a question with that trajectory in mind. And I'm going to do it really transparently. And at some point, I might even ask, I'm hearing a lot of different stories, and I don't know if there's a new outcome that's emerged, but are you still looking at moving towards presence in these different experiences that you're having? At which point, then the thinker has the choice to say, no, it's not really presence anymore, it's something else. Or, oh, yeah, that's what I'm actually wanting to focus on. And so I throw that out there because I think it's really important for coaches. This is the reason why agreement setting is so important. Because if you have an external processor, specifically, if you have an external processor, or really just any human being who has sort of the kind of tangential thinking that human beings seem to have, if we don't know that outcome that they want, it is so easy to get sucked into the interesting versus sticking with the important. So the interesting, all the stories, the important, the outcome that they're seeking to have. Clarity around how to be fully present, not spinning, but presence. And so I just think it's so important that we're paying attention to that. So what could this coach have done differently? Again, I think I've kind of mentioned it, have a clarity around that outcome. And as the thinker was describing all of these situations, if the coach had been more present themselves in that moment, they might have been able to notice the theme of what they were seeing happening as the client is talking about all these different things. And that's a really great place for a coach to do more of a transparent observation. Might I share an observation with you? I'm noticing that there are like all of these little moles that you're like whack-a-moling yourself. And I'm curious, as you hear me say that to you, what is the experience you're having right now? And how does that inform this idea of presence? Because they may be like, it doesn't, right? It totally doesn't demonstrate presence. It isn't connected to presence. Then what's important for you to notice from this so that you can have presence, right? So instead of worrying about all the different stories, starting to notice the themes and playing it back for the thinker. I think there's also a place where there is a somatic sensation. What is the experience you have when you're fully present? People are going to say different things. My shoulders are loose, or I just feel really grounded, or I'm just much more engaged than with the person and not like everything else going on around me. And it's a place where maybe the coach even uses their own somatic experience. If the coach is feeling like she is on the dance floor instead of observing this from a bird's eye view, that's a great piece of observation to share with a thinker. I'm noticing that I'm starting to spin too, and I'm curious, you know, what needs what do we need to explore to support moving towards that presence that you're seeking, or how does this interfere with your presence, or any number of questions. I'm not going to go into all of them, but there are a bunch of them. But again, if I don't know presence is the outcome, it's going to make it really hard. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to invite you to my monthly coaches Q&A. Happens twice a month on the third Monday of the month. It is my treat. We talk about all things coaching, and we often do coaching demos. You are absolutely invited. You can follow the QR code right up here, and I'd love to see you in that community. So please come join us. And let's go back to our video. I think the other thing that happens with coaches, and this is the thing that this particular coach talked about too, it's like there were so many different stories that they got lost, and they were like, I need to memorize all these stories. And my point in our mentor coaching was, no, you don't need to memorize all the stories. The stories are really interesting. They illustrate something, but you do not need to memorize them all. What you need to do is start paying attention to what theme might be going on below the surface so that you can test the hypotheses, right? Which is the story. That's a really great story of spinning. What do you need to learn from it? So that, right, you can move towards presence. What there took you out of presence that would be really important for you to be paying attention to, so that next time something starts going on where you find yourself spinning like that, you can notice it more effectively or efficiently, right? So it's really hard for us to keep all the stories. I don't know about your short-term memory. Maybe you're really good at it. But if the story isn't wildly interesting, I may not remember every element of the story, but I can start to pick out themes, and then I can test the hypotheses on those themes. So honestly, again, you don't need to remember all the stories. You need to remember the outcome. You really need to remember maybe a couple of the somatic indicators of the outcome. So for instance, if presence is the outcome, being able to take a breath, being able to focus, being able to have a sense of lightness. Maybe their chest is opening up, not having a tight, anxious feeling. You might want to remember a couple of those things and the outcome. These things become anchors for the person to start to create the dots, connect the dots, and then have the meaning making of the connected dots. And that's what we want for people. I've been talking a lot about this in my different presentations, about the difference between my vacation photos for me and your vacation photos for me, or my vacation photos for you. When you look at one of your vacation photos, you will have likely a very strong memory attached to that photo. Frankly, you don't even need to go on vacation. Pull out your phone and pick a couple of your favorite photos that are on your phone. And when you look at those pictures, what happens? Often we're taken back to that moment. We remember, I took a picture of my dogs on the bed with me, and I'm like, I'm just even thinking about it. I can remember I was laying there and the dogs were hanging out with me when I took the picture. I am somatically, mentally, psychologically, intellectually taken back into that moment when I see that image. But if you saw a picture of me with my dogs on my bed, you would probably not have that same feeling. Now, it might kind of trigger a memory you have of you on your own bed with your own pets, or with your kids, or with your spouse, or with your best friend, where you're just hanging out, having a good time. It might trigger another memory for you, but my picture all by itself is probably not going to do that for you. And as coaches, what we really want to be doing is, instead of creating pictures for people, we really want to be helping them take their own snapshots of their own experience. And so again, when we have the outcome that they want to move towards, and we say, what are you learning about yourself in this moment as it relates to your presence? They're going to, because they're having to think about that, and make meaning of that question and find an answer for that question, they're going to be taking their own photo in this conversation. These insights, this is how we get insights and ahas that actually carry on longer than the actual conversation that we've had. This is where people come back to us a week or 2 weeks later or a year later in some cases, where they're like, that conversation really stuck with me. And it's because they were able to take their own snapshots throughout a conversation, whether it was through the coach's ability to ask about the theme and not get lost in the stories, whether it was about asking the meaning that they're making from what they're sharing with us, whether it was through silence while they're processing and giving them that environment to think that Nancy Klein talks about in Thinking Environments. And so we want people to be taking their own internal pictures to remember these moments of awareness that they have. And I think maybe there's a couple other things that are important to be thinking about, but this will be the last one, is that we start to trust our own noticing. And I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but if I'm noticing myself spinning, or if I'm noticing I'm feeling that there's a theme here, I want to be transparent and give that information back to the thinker. And I want to do it in a careful, thoughtful way. I don't want to just say, you're spinning right now, and now I'm spinning too. But I might want to say, might I share an observation? I'm noticing that I feel like I'm spinning with you in this moment. And I'm curious what you can learn from this element of the conversation as it applies to what's important to you. Or what do you think is driving that right now? And what would it take to kind of move into presence in this moment in regard to what you want? I think that what this does is it allows that person to slow down, but it also is us sharing information they may not have. Most of us, when we're in the middle of a spin, we may know we're spinning, but we may not know we're spinning. And until somebody says to us, I'm starting to spin, I'm wondering what you're noticing for yourself, we may not slow down enough to notice that. I had a coaching conversation last year where the person was talking, and as they were talking, they were doing this. And I said, I really hear you. And as you're saying this, how does that point to what's important for today? And the response to me was, I'm just struck by your mirroring of me. And is that the energy I'm putting out into the world? I think I want to look at that. And I said, is that what we're looking at then? The energy that you're putting into the world? And their response was yes, because that was what emerged, because they were doing this, but it took my mirroring it back to them for them to see it in a new way. And that would be really, we're looking at 7.5 in the competencies, the sharing of information. I'm giving you information. I'm giving you feedback that is gentle, but also reflective of what it is that I am noticing. So honestly, we want people to do their own work. We want them to do their own work because we want them to take their own photos. It is not our job to perfectly wrap things, put a pretty bow on them, and hand them to them, which means that we can work a lot less hard. The biggest thing I want you to focus on is getting to a solid agreement, a solid outcome with clear indicators of that outcome, and then invite the thinker to take you through what's important to them. Ultimately, you're going to have a much more impactful conversation when you have clarity for yourself and they have clarity for themselves about what's important to them for the conversation today. And on that note, I would ask you to please share below any comments you have. If you have other ideas for other videos, let me know. I try and respond to all comments, like, subscribe, do all the things to help keep the channel going. And thank you for being here today. I'll see you in another video. Happy coaching.